stab in the back. That's how some U.S. lawmakers are labeling OPEC's decision to reduce oil production. The decision comes as the world is reeling from soaring energy prices in the aftermath of Russia's continuing assault on Ukraine. Most of the anger from U.S. Democratic senators have been directed at one country, Saudi Arabia. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer accused Riyadh of aligning with Russia to drive up oil prices. He said the Senate was looking at legislative tools to deal with what he called Saudi Arabia's cynical action. Meanwhile, Russia praised OPEC's decision to cut production by 2 million barrels a day and blamed the U.S. for volatile energy markets. The oil cartel, which comprises most of the world's top oil exporting nations, has long used its production quotas to influence global oil prices. The U.S. has been trying to sway oil producers for months to increase output in order to ease energy costs and to cut off Russia's main financial lifeline. So has Washington's influence over Saudi Arabia reached its end? And how will the U.S. respond to what it has called a betrayal? And to further discuss OPEC's production cut, I'm joined by Jamie Ingram from London. He's a senior editor at the Middle East Economic Survey, and Ibrahim El-Assil is a geopolitical analyst and also a senior fellow at Middle East Institute based in Washington, D.C. Gentlemen, welcome to Straight Talk. It's good to have you on the program. Jamie, let me begin with you. What do you make of OPEC's decision to cut oil production, and is there any significance to its timing?
Yeah, pleasure to be here. Thank you very much. Yeah, this has generated headlines around the world. Obviously, a lot of debate over the future of global oil demand, and then Saudi Arabia, OPEC comes here and they cut supply when we're heading into potentially a big, deep economic recession. I think it's important to point out that for the immediate term, the market should be pretty well supplied. We're expecting a surplus for the end of the year. But the big uncertainty, of course, is what happens after December with the EU embargo on Russian oil. That's the key uncertainty, and it could force OPEC Plus to reverse its strategy in the fairly near future if that knocks out a lot of Russian oil production.
So, Ibrahim, what's your take on that? I mean, are Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates testing the limits of their relationship with the West, especially the U.S.?
It's a pleasure being with you. I see that the decision by OPEC Plus to cut the production is a very significant decision on different levels. On the geopolitical one, and when we talk about Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, it's clearly that these two U.S. partners are trying to navigate a new world where they see that there is multipolar world at this point, and they are trying not to look like they revolve in the U.S. sphere only. They are trying to show that they are following their own interests, which they are actually doing, and they are trying to meet the target of their annual budget, while at the same time showing some independence from the United States. And of course, that's a risky decision, and that's a risky step that might be misread in Washington, D.C.
So would you agree, Jamie? I mean, the U.S. has accused OPEC of aligning with Russia, but Gulf states deny politics were at play, saying that they were acting accordingly to their interests. What's their reasoning?
Yeah, I agree 100% with that, to be honest with you. It's being portrayed frequently as being siding with Russia. I disagree with that. It's simply not siding with the US in this instance. They are taking their own economic interests as the key priority here. You know, I mean, I don't think it's much of a coincidence that Saudi Arabia revealed initial soundings for their 2023 budget in advance of the OPEC Plus meeting, and they massively increased their planned spending by about $40 billion. They need a lot of additional revenue for that, and it's no secret that that revenue primarily comes from oil.
So, Ibrahim, what do you make of U.S. reaction? Is the Biden administration, some U.S. senators and media outlets overreacting to OPEC's decision? Because just recently, Senator Menendez called on freezing all U.S. cooperation with Saudi Arabia, including arms sales. What do you think?
Well, first, I think for policymakers in Washington, D.C., they do need to see that the decision by OPEC Plus to cut production is a political and economic one. For the economic side, it makes more sense for Saudi Arabia to have the prices per barrel somewhere between 80 to 100, and they are much more comfortable when it's around 90. While for Russia, it's absolutely they needed to be above $100 to, of course, to compensate for their losses and for the sanctions they have and for not being able to sell the oil they want to the West the way they used to be before. But for Washington, D.C., they are giving their partners two options. It's like you are with us or against us.
Yes.
And I don't think that's the right reaction, because they're going to push their allies in the Middle East and in other regions as well, away further away from them towards China and Russia. I think policymakers in Washington, D.C. should not overreact to this decision, and they should try to go and see and read between the lines what those partners are trying to say and probably try to address some of their concerns.
So, Jamie, you just previously mentioned the EU cap, which is intended to set the price of Russian oil lower than where it is today. But some analysts argue that cap would make the logistics of oil trade more difficult and costly, especially when some EU nations continue to buy Russian oil. What's your take on that, and how is that going to play out? I mean, could this drive a wedge between EU and non-EU states, for example, like Turkey?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to note that there's two separate issues here. On the one hand, we have the EU embargo, which will essentially ban the import of seaborne Russian crude oil into Europe. And on the other hand, we have the proposed price cap by the G7, which in some ways waters down the ban, because it will permit the purchase of crude oil below a certain price level. The problem here is that even its proponents, frankly, they're unable to explain how it will work in practice, and that's because they don't know how it will work in practice. And that significant ambiguity just opens up room for middlemen. It will add a lot of unnecessary opacity to the market, and that's where corruption and issues thrive. There will be no winners from a price cap. It will just add unnecessary volatility to what is already a very volatile market. When it comes to relations with the rest of the world, and frankly, India and China, they're not going to sign up to any sort of price cap. Russia has said that they're not going to sell oil to countries that do sign up to a price cap, and there's no reason that India and China would do. They're already getting this oil very discounted, so why on earth would they want to embroil themselves in an unnecessary political mess with Russia?
Ibrahim, besides political messages, political statements by some U.S. senators, how will the U.S., you think, respond to OPEC's moves, and what options do they have at the moment?
The U.S. administration is really in a tough position at this point, because the decision by OPEC Plus to cut production, most likely it will lead to an increase in the prices, which is President Biden is already struggling with higher inflation. And of course, it's going to make also the issue, or the way the U.S. administration is able to deal with Russia in Ukraine, even more difficult. And that, of course, will reflect on the midterms and on the Democratic Party chances to keep their seats and to keep the majority in both chambers. Now, what they can do on the short term and the medium term, the reaction of the market so far hasn't been as dramatic as many expected. I expect President Biden try to release more of the reserve in the strategic petroleum reserve in the United States, and also to try to look somewhere else, try to see where the United States can get more oil and what it can do to work probably better with its allies and partners to avoid any further cuts in the future.
So speaking of partners, let's say, Jamie, I mean, could this decision push the Biden administration closer to an idea of easing some of the sanctions it has imposed on Venezuela and maybe on Iran?
Yeah, certainly Venezuela has been very much in the energy sector news recently, with speculation that the Biden administration might be prepared to ease restrictions there in order to allow Venezuela to increase production. Frankly, that wouldn't be the best of moves. Putting the justification of sanctions on Venezuela to one side, the situation is just that Venezuela will not be able to increase production anytime soon. So there's not going to be any short-term benefits for the US there. With Iran, it's a slightly different matter.
Yes.
There is a lot of oil that is floating in storage that can be shipped at a moment's notice, essentially, to any demand centers around the world. But it's very difficult to be easing sanctions Iran at the moment, when mainstream media is full of reports of mass protests in Iran, violence against protesters in Iran. So it would be a very toxic move domestically for the US to ease sanctions right now.
So speaking of another tool to counter OPEC by the US, Ibrahim, is the so-called NoPak, no oil producing and exporting cartels bill, likely to pass the Congress this time?
It doesn't seem so. I think the United States at this point doesn't need to take some aggressive steps towards the oil producers, because that's gonna just increase the mistrust and increase the problem at hand. At the same time, I do think that both the oil exporters in the Middle East, the US allies, and the United States should talk more and should explain the rationale behind these decisions and try to reach some middle ground where the oil exporters can also meet their budgets and balance their annual budgets, while at the same time look at the interest of the developed countries and the G7 and the United States in order for everyone to be able to help the global economy recover after the pandemic and probably lower the inflation and the prices around the world.
So, Jamie, we know that Russia praised the decision of OPEC. So how influential is Moscow in this grouping, and how is Russia going to benefit from this situation moving forward, especially its ongoing attack on Ukraine?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Russia is a very influential partner within the OPEC Plus movement. Sure, its influence has waned just as a result of the fact that its production has decreased significantly. Two things drive influence within OPEC and OPEC Plus. That's the amount of production, the amount of oil that you can produce, and it's your spare capacity, i.e., the amount of production, how much additional production can you release to global markets. But Russia, this is something that OPEC and Saudi Arabia they've looked for many, many years, decades, frankly, to bring Russia into the fold. They're not going to throw that away just over a spat that doesn't concern them particularly, which is how they perceive the Ukraine crisis. So that gives Russia a leeway. For Russia, frankly, OPEC Plus is one of the very few major international organizations where they have a very public position at the head of the table. So again, this is something that is incredibly important geopolitically for Moscow, because it gives them an avenue to flex their muscles and demonstrate that they're a major global power with connections to global market-moving discussions.
All right, gentlemen, and unfortunately, we'll have to leave it here. Thank you very much for joining me on Straight Talk.